to start with, I want to start with introducing myself. So I'm Sujata. I've been with Google now for about 7 years, and all of the time has been with a team called Trust and Safety. When in Trust and Safety, our mission is to protect Google users and the integrity of our products. And so that would mean preventing spam and abuse, testing a lot of products prior to launch, figuring out how they might be misused, and also communicating about it. Within that team, I lead the research function. We're a pretty small team, but we have a broad mandate because our goal is to provide the foundational knowledge on topics like spam and abuse vectors, of course, but also broader, more socio-political topics like misinformation or violent extremism. And we want to really understand these topics and provide the knowledge to the decision makers within product or within Trust and Safety or within our policy teams to help guide the choices that they make in the pursuit of user trust. And so with that, I think with my time that I spent at Google and even before Google at previous companies, we sort of, I think, come a long way in just how technology has shaped our lives and the demands that individuals and society is making from technology companies. So I wanted to start with just examining a little bit of what's going on very broadly on the technology landscape. So we've seen in the last decade and a little before that, there has been huge waves or upheavals which have shaped the products that are being created and also the scrutiny that companies are receiving as they create these products. We've seen, we've seen globalization, we've seen more people receiving access to information, demographic patterns have changed. So while, companies like Google or Facebook may be headquartered in the US, a large percentage of our users are not based in the US. They're based in other parts of the world. They have different cultures, different needs. We've also seen, this whole conversation. What increasing embedding of technology in everybody's lives is turning society into. You feel like, a lot of your data is being shared in order to give you better products. But yes, of course, they can be used in dangerous ways as well. And we've also seen a little bit of a techlash. We often see news articles about, the intents of these companies. What is it that we're doing? What commitments are we making to the society and to world? About how we're protecting our users. And so three main things, I think, at the moment we are in right now, there are sort of three main paradigms, which is, the rise of platforms, the increasing polarization of society and content creators and content consumers, and the opportunity to monetize. And these three paradigms together, I think, have led to new forms of exploitation, a lot of uncertainty. And, as we've seen in the recent past, even the potential of challenging democratic processes. And of course, this year particularly has been a little bit of, almost like an earthquake for the technology company with COVID, just the uncertainty that we face in terms of tech as well as work norms is shifting drastically. And so over time, we've begun to see that technology companies are having to expand their lens. So I won't go through each of them. I'll let you read through and mull over some of these sort of dichotomies that I've laid out on this slide. But essentially, for instance, we would often think about users first. But that is changing because now we have to think about creators, we have to think about advertisers, about publishers, about opinion formers, legislators. Companies in the past used to prioritize profitability, but today they are facing increasing questions about their business practices, about who they're employing, about the benefits that they're offering. So the lens and the scope of challenges that those of us in the technology company or even others are facing has expanded. And increasingly, we're doing it in in a very visible environment, and we are being scrutinized by many different parts of society, whether that's the government, whether it's employees within Google, whether it is the tech industry at large. There are good users, but there are also users who are looking to exploit our products. So it's just become a very open and very transparent and sometimes noisy environment. And so I think where we are today is, I don't think we have the answer to this question, which is tech going to be a force for good, or is it an engine of harm? And it sort of goes back to every time there's been a huge technological advance. I remember in school we used to have this debate topic, right? Like, is mass media good for the child? Is exposure to TV good for the child? Is it an idiot box? And often we used to counter that argument by saying that, hey, like the TV is a technological marvel, but the remote is in your hands, and you can decide if you want to change the channel and watch something more educational versus something that's not as educational. But with technology companies sort of becoming the gatekeepers of information, there is a general sense that perhaps the control or the remote, so to speak, is no longer in the hand of the users, because we are creating pathways for users to discover information, and the choice of switching, like the cost of switching between platforms or between channels, is extremely high. And so let's think about so that was sort of the outside in perspective, so what's happening outside the companies. But let's talk a little bit about what's happening within the companies. And many of you may be familiar with this. As we think about product design, product managers are often trying to understand, what is the moment that we are serving in the user's journey. And typically, products say that, we want to, and this is a perfect example of Google, right? Because Google says that, hey, I want to be able to help the user when they're experiencing, I want to know something. So we want to serve information to them. They're exploring travel. They're thinking about planning a trip. So we want to be able to provide the information at that point. Or they're looking to learn something, to braid your hair, and we want to be able to give you the videos that will allow you to do that, and so on. But we are beginning to see a new type of moment right now, which is an I need help moment. And an interesting part of this moment that we are encountering is often that this is an unintended consequence of the product design. And let's dig a little deeper into that. So this is just one example, but when search started out, and even today, we say that, we want to make the world's information universally accessible to everyone. We want to organize the information. We want to make it consumable. We never thought that people would come to the search query box, or even to our assistant, and start sharing some very intimate information with us, some of which is moments of distress like this one, or it could be moments of, just something that they can't ask anybody. And they're almost beginning to think of Google as a confidant, to someone that they can ask a very private, very intimate query. And I don't think that it took Google by surprise, because we did not expect straight out the bat that was what we were going to see. Similarly, we are beginning to see, the product's intent might be something, but we have seen many examples of where the actual use of the product is very, very different. And the one on the top right of this slide, I hope people remember, was a Twitter chatbot that was released called Microsoft Stay. And it was an excellent AI experiment. It was about natural language processing. It was about training an agent to respond in ways that seem sometimes almost human. But for those of you who remember the news, it very quickly became something completely different, and to the point where this chatbot started spewing a lot of offensive, hateful statements. And that was obviously not what the company expected. Facebook Live is another example. I think it's a tremendous platform that gives every user a voice, and we often have found people, streaming protests or streaming something really nice that they have seen that brings the world together. But at the same time, we've also seen it being used for, murder and suicide videos, or even posting terrorist propaganda. And so I think it's important to realize that no matter the design of your product and its primary purpose, there's a whole host of secondary purposes that may arise that you may not have thought of. And I think like this slide just goes to illustrate that there are so many different opportunities for the user to come and share their distress with you, not you as an individual, but you as an organization. And then the dilemma is, what do you do with that? How far can you act? Should you even act? Or is it okay to give some kind of a canned response saying, hey, I can't help you with this, and move on? Or do you have a responsibility to do something more? And over time, we've seen over and over again through the course of the research that we've done within Google and with other organizations, is always that when there's a product launch, usually the targets that are set straight out the bat are all around user acquisition and scale. When you hear about startups pitching their products, asking for investments, they're always talking about, this is how we're going to break even, this is how we will reach critical mass. It's all about user engagement and keeping the user hooked to your platform. And then what we've seen is that many products run into this unexpected user journey or an unexpected vector of abuse that they did not think about. And then that leads to rolling back offerings, holding expansion, and in many cases, doing a complete policy revision as well. And so that is the blind spot. We know, like instinctively, even as I'm describing some of these situations to you, you may be feeling, we've heard this before, this is not new. But the question you must ask yourself is, who is responsible for doing the testing? Who is responsible for thinking about the longevity of the product from an angle of user trust? Is it the engineering team? Is it the public policy team? Is it a research team like mine? Or is it the PR teams who have to think about, okay, what could go wrong with this product? And there's one aspect of responsibility, but there's also a question of accountability. So who is going to be held accountable for maintaining user trust in the long run? And so given that, we've sort of understood what the outside landscape looks like, what the enterprise looks like from within, and sort of the preoccupations of product managers, let's think about what are potential solutions. And the disclaimer here is that nobody has solved this question. I mean, Google hasn't, and no other organization, I think, has. But I think there are very interesting developments that we're seeing from various companies, and I'd like to share some of those developments with you. And I'd also like to offer a few examples. But what I'm really hoping you will walk away with is food for thought. And as you go back and, you may be a UX researcher, you could be a product designer, or a product marketer, or a coder. I hope that, you'll keep some of these thoughts in the back of your mind as you're working on your product. So the first thing I think we need to acknowledge is that products exist in an ecosystem. For too long, we've developed products in this secret software lab where the latest and greatest products are designed. But I think that is a mind shift that every organization is going through right now, is that you really don't exist in a silo. A perfect example is I shared earlier on in the conversation the trends that we've seen around self-harm and suicide queries. Now, we can approach that as an engineering problem, but the very first decision you need to make is, what is Google's responsibility here? Should Google do something about it? And so that's the first hurdle. And let's say we do decide that, yes, we should offer resources because it is a form of information that we want to organize and make accessible to our users. So it aligns with our mission. So definitely Google should do something about it. Now, once you've made that decision, it still is a massive problem because immediately there's language. So you have to train models to recognize when something is a self-harm query versus when something is seeking information. You have to then train it in multiple languages. You have to then train it on multiple surfaces because people could be putting this query in on the desktop. It could be spoken into a voice assistant. It could be on a phone. So you have to create something that is transferable across all of these surfaces. But all of this is still within Google. But there's a point at which we realize that, all right, we're going to surface some information. We're going to feature a partner. So when someone puts in a query like this, we will provide a one box that has a phone number that people can call. Now, which organization should be featured there? That's not, Google alone cannot make that decision because it depends on what's available in the country. It depends on the capacity of the organization that we're going to feature. And the problem that we have run into sometimes is, in some countries, there just isn't enough funding or recognition of mental health as an issue, and there isn't enough funding for organizations who we might feature on the one box. So imagine if Google were to put an organization's phone number there and they get inundated with calls and they just don't have the capacity to answer these calls. That's only going to make the situation worse. And when we have, in fact, launched one boxes with this information in certain countries, we've also received very mixed feedback from users. There are some users who acknowledge that this is very useful. Thank you for putting this on here. Sure, it's going to help people at that crucial moment. But there are also users who come back saying, why are you doing this? I am looking for information. You should just serve the information. You shouldn't try to influence my mindset. So all of this goes to prove that what seems on the surface like a very simple engineering or a ranking or algorithmic question can very quickly turn into something much bigger than that. And that will have players from the government, from civil society, and it also depends on the capacity of your own organization and the mission that you've laid down for yourself. The other thing that I want to highlight is and this, I'll talk about this within the context of Google. What we have found is that using a framework that very clearly lays down, here's how we are designing policies, and the policies sit on top of product features. So we want to say, for instance, like if you are going to go into Google and you type something, Google often offers an autocomplete. So it recommends that, hey, most people who started typing a query with these words tended to end the query with these phrases. So this is probably what you're looking for. So that's a product feature. But the policies that then we needed to think about were, what if people are going to complete this query in really offensive ways? What if people are looking for individuals and they combine the individual with some negative term, and people could organize and they could try to game this system. And so then there is a policy that says, okay, what groups are going to be protected groups where we will not do an autocomplete? What types of queries do we not want to autocomplete? And so that's what I mean when I talk about policy sitting on top of features. This policy design, and I'll go a little deeper into that, cannot be developed in a silo. It can't just be 3 or 4 Googlers sitting in a room thinking about what's okay and what's not. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We also need to be really transparent about these policies. We need to let users know what is acceptable, what isn't, why we're making the decisions we are. And then the second part is you've designed a feature, you've put a policy, then you have to enforce. And you have to communicate this enforcement to individuals. So there has to be notice whether something is being taken down or it isn't, if it's remaining up or not. You have to be able to explain that decision-making process to users. You also have to allow them to appeal the decision so that, if you had a false positive, you made a mistake, or there's a different interpretation, then you're able to take that into account. And finally, the intelligence that you're gathering from the content, from the information, or the types of badness that you are seeing needs to be made available, not just to product engineering terms within your company, but more broadly. So, for instance, if you are coming, especially in the current time of misinformation, if you're finding that there is a certain group that is organizing and attacking and creating like bots that are amplifying negative information, then that lead should not just be shared within Google and Google's different product teams, but it also should be made available to Facebook, to Twitter, and to all other companies that are working in a similar space. I talked about policy design, and I mentioned that there are many different ways to do this, and it could be, most importantly, it has to be participatory. And we've seen many examples of how this participatory policy making is coming to the fore. So I've just put a couple of examples here. So Google released the artificial intelligence principles. The reason I put this here, because the one thing that I find interesting is that it doesn't just talk about what AI should do, but it also very clearly lays out what applications Google will not pursue. And I think that is as important in policy design, is not just saying what's acceptable, but also as a product, what are things that we will never invest in. So that is something that was developed with advice and in consultation with many different parties, but it was developed from within Google. And then you have something like the Santa Clara Principles. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this is a group of independent academics and researchers who came together to think about what are the requirements of transparency and accountability that platforms like Google and Facebook and Twitter have, even Apple for that matter, because Apple has an app store. What are the demands on transparency that society or governments or users can make of these companies? And they put together a set of principles. And this was something that was completely independently developed of these organizations. But it is rooted in research. It is rooted in people who are experts in the space, and it's influenced. It's also very inclusive because the group had representation from many different academic areas, but also many different regions. And a lot of the companies have ratified these principles. So they've said that, we commit to these principles, and they started adopting some of the recommendations. And then you have also very recently, Facebook announced the Oversight Board, which is sort of like this group of external experts, again, a very diverse, very inclusive set of experts that Facebook is almost going to refer some of these gray area cases to, and Facebook is going to take their advice and provide a lot more transparency to this group. So these are sort of some of the models that exist in participatory policy design. I don't think that any one is better than the other. It's important to realize that I think what is important for me is that all these three models exist. So you combine, your approach should combine all of the benefits of each of these three approaches, and they should coexist as product managers are thinking about what's okay and what's not okay on my product. And then you also have to communicate the decisions that you're making. And so YouTube publishes a pretty regular enforcement report, which talks about what videos were removed, why were they removed, who reported these videos, were they automated or manual, and how many videos were removed before they were watched by anyone, and how many were removed after at least one person had seen it. I want to go a little deeper into this removal and implementing the policies. And some of you may recognize this. There was a huge New York Times article about it, which was about locksmiths exploiting Google Maps. And so if you were to go on to Google and search for, I need a locksmith near me, you would find a lot of listings. Sometimes it was the same company or the same provider, but they had multiple listings, and some of them didn't really have storefronts. And you would perhaps call one of these locksmiths, they would come home, or they would make you pay online and they would never show up. So once you receive the information online, the abuse shifted offline. And so that would happen in a one-on-one conversation with the provider, and they would find many different ways of exploiting the individual. And so this was what the users saw, is that Google Maps is failing at this one topic. But when you look at what was actually happening, the abuse vectors themselves were several different types, and I've listed them all in the gray boxes. So it started from something as just the URL itself was fake. There was no such locksmith who would come and help you get in. But we also had some more complicated kind of behavior where someone would hijack a legit locksmith, or even, and this is, locksmith is just one vertical, but this could happen on any business vertical. So it could be someone that hijacks an existing listing and then uses it for nefarious purposes. And that complexity is something that we dug very deep into and tried to understand the signals that we could use to predict that something like this was happening. And then it resulted in a set of policies, guidelines that we provided, not just to business owners, but also to users, to know that, you know, here are the things that will not be allowed on the system. And so I think, you know, I hope that this was kind of an interesting angle for you to think about. Working in trust and safety, sometimes it makes you very cynical, because every time a new product is being planned for launch, my team is always the one saying, here are all the reasons that this product is not going to work, or here are all the reasons how your product can be exploited. And sometimes you see a lot of disturbing, really negative behavior, and it kind of makes you think that, you know, perhaps the world isn't such a great place and everyone's out to exploit these products. But I think over time we've realized that it is a moment of responsibility, and it's engineers alike, not just researchers or policymakers, but even engineers and coders and researchers need to think about this larger ecosystem. And so I want to reiterate some of the things that I hope you will walk away with. The first thing being that let's acknowledge that products do not exist in a silo, and they have this whole decision ecosystem that is working around what comes out of a company or what comes out of a piece of code. The second thing to acknowledge is that you may have a certain intent as you're developing a feature, but there can be a host of secondary uses and secondary purposes to that product that you need to think about, even as you're designing. So you do need to test each and every loophole in your code or in your product. And then the third thing to think about is, as you discover all of these ways that that the product can be misused, you have to define the policies that will prevent that misuse. But that policy definition has to be participatory, and it's always a good idea to include a really diverse set of people who are, or experts who are advising you and consulting with you. And there is always an expectation of transparency. So this whole process of acknowledging the ecosystem, designing the product, thinking about secondary features, defining the policies, building the systems to enforce those policies has to happen in a way that you know can be audited at any time. So you always have a transparency first approach. But I think it's a really exciting time in technology. We know that the products that we are building today are going to have far-reaching impact on the world. It can change society in very fundamental ways. And so that's really exciting. So that's all I had. I'm going to stop presenting and see if there are any questions. Any questions?
Can you hear me?
Hey, Mukherjee, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that awesome presentation. And if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat.
So I think, Mukherjee, do you want me to just get started with the questions?
Oh, sure. If you want me to facilitate, or you can go ahead and answer. Okay.
Okay, so Tiffany's had a question. Why do you think Google and Facebook disbanded their ethics committees? It would be like if there's a specific committee you're talking about, it'd be great to share that. I know that Google put together an AI principles oversight committee that we then rolled back because of the inclusion of certain polarizing figures. I'm not sure about the Facebook ethics committee being disbanded, but they do now have the oversight board. And I think that, like I said, sometimes there are blind spots as we are pulling some of this together. We are bringing these teams together. There are blind spots that the teams may have. But what's important is that we continue to evolve. And I think that for Google specifically, while we don't necessarily have this AI principles ethics committee, what we have done, and if you go to the Google AI principles blog, you'll find that we are providing regular updates on the progress we're making, the consultations that we're using, and the experts that we're referring to. So it is an evolutionary process. I don't think that any organization has nailed this whole process down.
Okay, you have another question. What special employee training is helping with unconscious bias in products and services?
So for specifically for us, as a researcher, I can talk about it. We do, for anyone who's doing research at Google, we undergo a pretty rigorous training around research ethics in general, but also very specifically working with user data and the ethics of using user data within Google. For product designers, there's unconscious bias training that everyone undergoes. We also have within Google, we've established a responsible AI and innovation committee. So whenever there is a new product that is being designed, or whenever there is even a new application that is not being designed by us, but is going to reside on our platform, for instance, a client building an application on top of our cloud platform, these are all flagged for review to this AI principles committee. And so the first thing is they would go over the principles, they would look for loopholes, or they would look for instances where we are not in alignment with the principles, and those would immediately get rejected. But if there are things that they are not able to resolve, that then gets referred to a cross-functional executive committee at Google. And if even they cannot resolve it, then it does get referred to external experts. So it's not just about the training. I think it's also about the processes that we've put around enforcing the principles that we've laid out. So we do have, and it depends on whether it's AI or whether it's UX research, or whether it is even for us within enforcement, if we are building a model to take down certain information which we qualify as hate or offensive, there are the processes to try and keep that in balance. Yeah. How do you think targeted marketing effects creates possible loopholes in a product or service? I'm not really sure what this question means. Can you add a little bit more context? One thing I can talk about with targeted marketing, if you mean remarketing, for instance, I can think about certain verticals that we identified from the research team where we do not want to remarket. So there are just certain topics where if you see an ad, or even if you click on it on one platform or on one product, it's very unlikely that you will see that again. And these are usually sensitive topics, but I'm not sure if remarketing is what you're talking about.
All right. Did anyone else have any questions? Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation, and you gave a lot of insight. And I've also documented these questions as well, so you can have access to those.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right. So we have our next session starting soon. So we'll see everyone in the next session. Thank you so much for everyone who attended, and Sujata for your presentation. And we'll look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.